Many of us are very familiar with Aaron Isaac. He has given so many programs for us over the years. If you had anything to do with the streetcar, you're familiar with him. If you had anything to do with the Metro bus line, you're familiar with him. Anyway, he's a 40-plus year volunteer with the Minnesota Streetcar Museum, where he serves as historian, board chair, and a motorman. He has some wonderful books. You'll have to tell us, I think we kind of alluded to that you had a book out on this topic.
I'll be talking about it.
Okay. And some people are interested in it, so you'll just that. Okay. If you look on our website, you'll see that we have recorded several of his programs. Last year we did the Living New Deal and the Linden Hills 101, which we were really thrilled because he and Peter Sussman did a great job of going over the history of Linden Hills. And then Minneapolis reuses the railroad and other programs. I should move on because we've been taking some time here. So he has a number of books available: Twin Cities by Trolley, Twin Ports by Trolley, Lake Harriet Streetcar Line, and and another booklet, the 1940s, and then the Interurban Special Number 14. So do look for him at the library or other places. I'd like to welcome Aaron right now. Thank you. We'll have time for questions afterwards.
Okay. Well, hi, everybody. Let's see. Oh, good. The mic's working. The last book I wrote, and probably the last book I will write, is this one with the same title as this show. And so the show today is based on this. First, I have to ask, how many of you have taken a train trip on Amtrak? Okay. Now, Amtrak took over from the railroad. The passenger trains in the 60s were losing tremendous amounts of money. People were leaving them, and the railroads needed to get out from under the burden of that, and so Amtrak was created. And so Amtrak took over all of it in 1971. And all the former passenger trains, the transportation system was slimmed down dramatically. But how many of you rode trains before Amtrak? Okay, good. We have a crowd of a certain age here. So anyway, the reason I wrote this book is that from here to Chicago was the most competitive railroad passenger corridor in North America. It had more trains. It had the best trains in North America, and so I'm kind of paraphrasing the book here. So let's, just right here, this one. There we go. Okay, now, this is a snapshot from 1910. There were 7 different railroads that ran between Chicago and the Twin Cities over 9 different routes. There were 2 of them that had a second route to do it. And when you compare just the number of railroads and the number of routes in 1910 to these other major corridors, New York, Chicago, and all that, you'll see the Twin Cities simply had more competition. And a lot of that was the big transcontinental railroads, the Northern Pacific, the Great Northern, the Soo Line / Canadian Pacific into Canada, and then later the Milwaukee Road, were these northern transcontinentals that went to the West Coast. They all funneled into the Twin Cities and ended there. And these other railroads competed to carry their freight and their passengers to Chicago. So it all started in 1865. The very first railroad in the Twin Cities just ran from St. Paul to Minneapolis, the St. Paul and Pacific, and it was completely isolated from the national system in 1862, and it just fed riverboats in St. Paul. But the second one was the Minnesota Central, which became part of the Milwaukee Road, and it built down through Northfield, Faribault, Owatonna, and down into Iowa, and it wound up connecting to Chicago in 1865, and here's the first train. So, if you look at all these railroads together, you can see they took a whole bunch of different routes. I'm not going to go through every one of them, but there were 7 different routes between Chicago and the Twin Cities. And these were the railroads, and their mileage varied from the Chicago Northwestern through Madison at 399 miles, all the way down to the Rock Island, way down through Iowa at 510 miles, but they were all competing for this ridership and the passengers. And so that network was in place basically by about 1890. The Rock Island came in 1902. And so starting in the 1890s, they began competing for ridership on that line, and every one of these railroads put together the best train they possibly could. And I got pictures of a few of them. This is the Wisconsin Central that then became the Sioux Line, and it went over through Appleton, Wisconsin, Wisconsin Rapids, that area, to get to Chicago. And this is its train, its 1890s train, leaving the Minneapolis Union Station, which right hard on the river. You can see the Hennepin Avenue Arch Bridge in the background there. This is the Minneapolis and St. Louis, which even though it didn't go to Chicago, it teamed up with first the Rock Island and then later the Illinois Central from Albert Lea to go to Chicago. And this is the North Star Limited. This is the Milwaukee Road, and that's the short line bridge that still stands and is still in use all over the Mississippi between Lake Street and Franklin. And they were very proud of their trains. The Northwest, Chicago Northwestern, this is the Northwestern Limited, which was the big overnight from here to Chicago. And the Burlington, which ran up the river, the east bank of the river, all the way from Savannah, Illinois, up through La Crosse. Great trains. Here's again the Minneapolis and St. Louis when they were going with the Illinois Central to Chicago. Here's the Chicago Great Western that went down through Old Wine, Iowa, and Waterloo to get to Chicago. Now, every 10 years, these lines went and re-equipped their trains. And there were basically 3 generations of railroad equipment. And so it started with all wood equipment in the 1890s up through about 1910. And this was back, there's a term which I'm not sure the public necessarily knows, but the term is varnish. And varnish became a catch-all term for railroad passenger cars. And it's because of these wood cars that were varnished and beautiful. They were usually painted a dark green or maybe a dark wine red with all sorts of gold striping on them. And it was the Victorian sensibility. And so we'll look through some typical, this was a typical day coach. And the day coaches were somewhat Spartan. That's what they call a walkover seat, a not terribly comfortable seat, but you could go and flip them so that you didn't have to turn the car at the end of the line. You could just flip the seats to go backwards. They didn't have electric lights in them yet. Those are gas light fixtures. But that's a coach. But then you get into first class. All these trains had first class accommodations. And this is a parlor car. And I love the term parlor car. Ain't that an old-fashioned Victorian term? But this was first-class travel. And so although these trains were not particularly fast, they took, 14 hours, 15 hours to make it from Chicago to the Twin Cities. They were luxurious if you had the money to pay for them. Here's a dining car on the Chicago Great Western's train to Chicago. And this was typical. Once again, those are gas light fixtures up on top. Because we're talking about the 1890s right here. Almost all the trains had sleeping cars because for 2 reasons. First, it was a long trip. It was like 14, 16 hours or so, and it was usually overnight. Business travel was the lifeblood of the railroad passenger business back then, and businessmen were not going to waste their time on a 14-hour day train. They were going to go and get on at like 7 o'clock at night or so, or 6 o'clock at night, and sleep overnight on the train and get in the next morning to go and do their business and have their business day and then get on another train and sleep overnight to go back. And so what you're looking at here on the left-hand photo is the way the thing is configured in the daytime. And the bunks are folded up into the ceiling. And then you see on the right, the bunks are folded down. There's an upper bunk and a lower bunk. And this is exactly the same thing that you saw in old Laurel and Hardy movies. In the movie Some Like It Hot, where Marilyn Monroe is in the upper bunk with the all-girl band. These are what they called sections, or rather open sections, where all that separated you from the aisle was just a curtain. And this was the standard sleeping car arrangement for about 20 years or so. And then here is the tail car, the observation car. Once again, it's another parlor car, fancy. And then, so that lasted, all wood passenger cars lasted until about 1910, and that's when the technology advanced so you could make steel passenger cars. And so steel passenger cars became the standard, and these are what they called heavyweights, because that's just what they were. They were heavy, and they're incredibly durable. And so starting in 1910 up through about 1935, this was the standard type of passenger car. And by the way, you'll see that this is a Pullman. Pullman ran almost all the sleeping cars in North America. It was the biggest hotel in North America, only it moved. And every railroad, with a very few exceptions, contracted with Pullman to operate the sleeping car services. And that, by the way, the African Americans who served on the sleeping cars were the Pullman porters. Tom,
Is that a particular depot in the background?
no, that's the Pullman plant. That's just the plant there. This was a builder's photo. So that's not local. But I just pulled this out, it's generic. These things, this was a very kind of standard car. And the sensibility, the Victorian sensibility went away, and these things were really kind of Spartan. Here's a day coach. And once again, very unadorned. Now they've got electric lights. They were able to generate electricity on here. Here's a sleeping car. It's the same kind of configuration, but once again, it's not as ornate and everything. Here's a parlor car. It's the same kind of thing. Here's a dining car. And so during this kind of heavyweight era, this was really the peak in terms of the number of trains. It peaked about 1920. And you could go just kind of from anywhere to anywhere. And by the way, today there are 2 trains each way in the Chicago Twin Cities corridor. Starting in the 1890s and all the way up through the 1950s, there were 18 to 19 trains each way every day. However, because of the competition, they tended to be grouped into about 3 departure times. And there was so much competition, the trains would leave, competing trains to Chicago would leave on the same moment and would arrive in Chicago within minutes of each other and vice versa, because they were competing. Now, what they had during this period of the slow trains, trains that were anywhere from 12 to 14 to 16 hours, was that you had early departures in the evening, like 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock p.m., to get business people for the start of the day. And then there were a bunch of departures around 10 to 11 o'clock p.m., which would get you in mid-morning to noon the next day, but that was if you were a business person, you had an afternoon appointment. That's what you would take. And then they had a few day trains, but the day trains, once again, it filled a slot in the schedule. So here are some of those 19 trains from the period from 1910 to just generally through the 20s. This is the Burlington. This is down by Newport. Here's the Sioux Line by North St. Paul. Here's the Rock Island in downtown Minneapolis at the Milwaukee Road Depot, which, by the way, you'll notice still has the cupola that's on top of the tower. That thing was blown off in a windstorm or something at some point. This is the Chicago Great Western pulling into the St. Paul Union Depot. That's the old Farwell Osmond Kirk building that's still there. This is the Milwaukee Road. And by the way, this one, the Milwaukee Road, was the primary railroad for handling the mail between the Twin Cities and Chicago. And the 2 cars following the engine are railway post office cars. And they hauled a huge volume of mail between the Twin Cities and Chicago. And the post office cars were staffed with post office employees who, by the way, were all armed with pistols because this was required. And their job was to sort the mail and both pick up and toss out mail all the way along the line. And so when you get in one of these railway post office cars, it had all kinds of cubby holes and mail sacks and stuff, and there would be 6 or 8 clerks in there sorting the mail, and as they would go through towns, they would either, if they stopped, they would let off the mail bag, pick up the mail bag from Minneapolis. For the limited trains, the ones that weren't making all the stops, what they would do is they would simply throw the mailbag out the door. and it would bounce along the platform and be picked up by the station agent. And then the mail they would pick up on the side of it, and I don't know if you can see that or it's almost impossible to see, but back by one of the doors is what's called the mail hook. And it's a hook like this, and the station agent would hang up on what he called a mail crane, would hang the mail sack up there, and you'd go and put the hook out, and at speed, and we're talking like 60, 70 miles an hour, whap, it would pick up the mail bag and pull it into the car and sort the mail. It was really a heck of a system, and one of the things that killed the passenger trains was that the post office stopped transporting the mail by train about 1967, and that was the death knell. They were making a fair amount of money off that, and it was subsidizing the rest of the operation. And so the trains would be re-equipped with the best stuff they could. And this is the Pioneer Limited. The Pioneer Limited was the overnight on the Milwaukee Road. In 1925, they went and re-equipped it. So the stations, you know the Milwaukee Road Depot. Here's the Milwaukee Road Depot as we know it today, or as it was then. This is actually the original Milwaukee Road Depot on the same site, right down at Washington Avenue and about 4th Avenue South. And it was replaced by the one we're familiar with today. And here you see once again the cupola on top that didn't last, and you can tell it's this is probably about 1910 or so. You got the streetcar there. Here's a picture of it in its later days with the Morning Hiawatha getting ready to leave town, and that's either the Winnipegger, the Soo Line Winnipegger from Winnipeg, or it's something else that I'm not familiar with. But so there were two stations in downtown Minneapolis. The one was the Milwaukee Road. The Milwaukee Road had the Milwaukee, the Soo Line, and the Rock Island ran out of there. Over on Hennepin Avenue was the Union Station, which was, this is right at the foot of Hennepin Avenue on the south side. This is where the post office is today. But it was replaced in 1914 by the Great Northern Station, owned by the Great Northern, but it hosted the trains also of the Northern Pacific, the Burlington, the Chicago Great Western, and the Minneapolis and St. Louis. And so here's a picture. Obviously, this is all parkland now. You can see the post office on the left, the Hennepin Avenue Bridge in the distance, but there's a depot, and this lasted until Amtrak. And Amtrak used it for a little bit. It was way too much station for the 1 or 2 trains a day that they had. And so they went and built a little station over in the St. Paul Midway, got rid of this, and now the Federal Reserve Bank is on this. So while Minneapolis had 2 stations, St. Paul had only the St. Paul Union Depot, and this is the original one. And it's where the present depot is today. This suffered a big bad fire about 1910 or so. It had, and so they replaced it with the St. Paul Union Depot, which opened kind of in stages between 1920 and 1924. And here we are up on, I think on the First National Bank building, looking down on the St. Paul Union Depot. By the way, to the very right is the St. Paul Post Office. Because the mail was handled by the rail, the main post offices were always located right next to the railroad station. And there was actually underground tunnels connecting the two, so you could go and move the mail to and from the post office. And here's the concourse of the St. Paul Union Depot, which of course is open today, used for events, and also now Amtrak is back in there. And you can see it was a pretty big deal. St. Paul Union Depot had a lot of trains. Now there's only one platform with 2 tracks over on the left, just to provide the contrast for you. The passenger trains became safer, became almost more luxurious as you moved into the 1920s, but they didn't get any faster. And the railroads were kind of operating, they said, hey, we got a transportation monopoly here. And that was the case until 1920, but then along came 3 things. Along came competition. And the main thing was the automobile. All across public transportation in every form, whether it is railroads or streetcars or the automobile, finally starting in 1920, there were enough of them that they began to erode the ridership. They began to take ridership away from the railroads, away from the streetcars, and all through the 1920s, that ridership declined. and the highways were being built. Highway 12, starting in 1926, Highway 12 from Chicago through Madison, through Eau Claire to the Twin Cities was designated a federal highway in 1926. And by 1930, about 300 miles of it were paved. And you could now, if you were in an automobile and you were averaging 40 miles an hour, and you took an hour off for lunch and to gas up the car, if you did that, you could get to Chicago to the Twin Cities in 10 hours, and the trains were still taking 12, 13 hours. And so the automobile started to be forced. And of course, once the highway started to be paved, motor buses starting in the 1920s were created. Well, they had a much lower cost structure because someone else is paying for the highways. And so way up in northern Minnesota, Northland Transportation started out of Hibbing, moved down, became based in the Twin Cities, and the Great Northern Railroad bought it. Because the Great Northern Railroad, seeing their branch line passenger trains becoming less and less patronized, said, you know, if we were to put buses on instead of those little branch line feeder passenger trains, we could run 5 buses for what it costs to run 1 passenger train. And so the Great Northern went and sponsored Northland Greyhound, moved it to Chicago. It became Greyhound. Eventually, Great Northern sold it. But they began running from Chicago to the Twin Cities in the 20s, and this is one of their buses. Now, we're along Lake Pepin, south of Lake City, and you're running right next to the Milwaukee Road, which is the competition. And I don't know if you can see it or not on the back of the bus, but you'll see that the bus has a little fake observation platform and what we called a drum head. That's what the back end of a railroad train looked like. They were mimicking the competition, and it took them like 14 hours to 15 or 16 hours to make the run, but they were able to go and compete for the short haul trips and offer for these small towns in between more frequency. So that was one competition. And that led in the 1930s to the creation of the downtown bus depot, which we now know as First Avenue Nightclub. And there you see next to it the first of the kind of classic Greyhounds with with the passenger compartment raised, luggage under the passenger compartment, engine in the rear, and air conditioned. And these started showing up by Yellow Coach, which was a subsidiary of General Motors in the late 1930s. Not only that, in 1926, Northwest Airlines was formed. And they started hauling mail from Chicago to the Twin Cities, but in 1927 they put on their first passenger flight. And by the 1930s, they were flying about 4 times a day, and it took, in these Ford Tri-Motors, about 4 hours to make it from Chicago. They went Chicago, stopped in Milwaukee, stopped in Minneapolis, and they did a 15-minute hop over to St. Paul to home and field. 4 hours. And so this was competition that wasn't really cutting in. I mean, this was very high priced and and a little risky at the time, but nonetheless it was competition. Okay, so along comes the Great Depression, and passenger train ridership had been dropping. Well, now it really dropped because the economy dropped by 30, 40, 50% in some places. It was a major hit. And so you had a combination of the railroads being desperate. We have to do something to compete in the passenger field. And you have that combined with some other factors. There had been some technological improvements along the way. The first air-conditioned train, the Baltimore and Ohio ran that in 1930. And roller bearings came in, which reduced the technical problem of overheated axles, which would sometimes cause derailments. And you had the creation, also about 1930, of something they called tight lock couplers. Have you ever seen the movie The Music Man? And there's the sequence in the beginning of the movie where you have all these traveling salesmen on this train, and the train is constantly lurching, and these guys are falling over. That's because of what you call slack action. Well, they came up with something called tight lock couplers that got rid of slack action. Okay, that's one more improvement. The other thing that began to happen in the 1920s is that people were getting tired in sleeping cars of riding in open sections. They didn't like the privacy. They didn't like having to climb up into an upper berth. And Pullman Company began building sleeping cars with separate little bedrooms in them, with a door that would close, and you had your own little private room. So all those things were starting to happen, and they started to speed the trains up some. Well, come 1934, and then the final thing that happened was Art Deco. And Art Deco came out of a design show in Paris in 1925 or so. But when you got into the 1930s, the streamlined modern kind of subset of Art Deco sort of swept America. And out came the Busby Berkeley movies and the Fred Astaire musicals, with and even though you're in the depths of the Depression, you have these tremendous interiors with these sleek, boudoirs and all that. And so you had all of these things, a combination of railroad desperation, we got to do something, a certain number of technical advancements, competition by other modes that's really starting to hurt, and a whole aesthetic revolution in Art Deco. And so in 1934, the Chicago Northwestern Railroad, which didn't have quite as much money, but they went and took a steam engine and their heavyweight cars and said, we're going to see how fast we can get this from Chicago to the Twin Cities. Now, it used to be that they were taking 10, 11, even 12 hours. They made it in 6.5 hours from Chicago to St. Paul, which required taking a railroad which was going 60 or 70 miles an hour and upgrading it to go 90 to 100 miles an hour. And so this is 1934, and the 400 was named, their line between the Chicago and the Twin Cities was 400 miles, 399 miles. And so they named the train the 400 because it made it in 400 minutes, a mile a minute average. And they put this train in, and it kind of turned the whole pasture thing on its head. Here it is leaving Chicago. Now, this table here shows how travel time improved. And if you look in 1891, and by the way, I have it 1891 through 1962, and first you can see the number of trains that went from 15 in the 1890s to 18 or 19, 17, all the way through the 50s, finally down to about 10 or so in the 60s, each way, trains each way. Okay, now, you look at the average travel time and take it from 15 hours and 40 minutes. And by the way, by average travel time, I'm talking about from Chicago to St. Paul. It always took another half hour to get to Minneapolis, and they were never able to do much about that. But so this is Chicago to St. Paul. And so it goes from 1540, 1910, it was a little bit better, but you see from 1910 to 1926, there was almost no improvement. But then you go from 1926 to 1945, and this is actually you could use for the about 1938. You're now down to 9 hours and 35 minutes. But now look at the fastest time, which is the next column. Before it was 12 hours, now suddenly it's 6 hours. And the slowest times, there were always some local trains that were never going to be very fast. But when you went from a 12-hour down to 6 hour, it changed the nature of the corridor. Let's get back to the business people who rode the trains. Before, remember, they had no alternative but to take an overnight to the other city for the business meeting, have it, and take another overnight to get back. That's a 2-night and 1-day commitment. What they quickly discovered, once you had these 6-hour trains, is that you could go and leave in the morning. If you had an afternoon appointment, you would get in by about 1 o'clock. You could have your appointment. You could take an overnight back. You've cut out one overnight. Or it would work the same thing. You could take the afternoon fast train to the Twin Cities, have a morning appointment the next day, and then take the other fast train back. And once again, it was only 1 night instead of 2. So it really revolutionized it. The other thing is, if you were traveling just for pleasure, before you were going to spend 12, 14 hours on a train, very likely in a sleeper, which cost more. Now you could just buy a coach ticket, which always costs significantly less than a sleeper ticket, and just get there in the same day. And especially if you were traveling with children, boy, did that make it a whole lot easier. Okay, so this is how things improved. And so the 400, with their steam engine, their heavyweight equipment, threw out the challenge. The Burlington and the Milwaukee Road responded. And the Burlington responded with the Twin Zephyrs. Twin Zephyrs for the Twin Cities. And one of the technological improvements that had happened in the early 1930s was the use of lighter weight steel. And the Pullman Company and American Car and Foundry, who are two of the big builders, went to something called Corten steel, which cut the weight of the steel car by something like 40%. And allowed you to, but a new upstart company called the Budd Company in Philadelphia had figured out in the early 1930s how to weld stainless steel. Before that, no, they knew what stainless steel was, but they couldn't weld it. They came up with electronic zap kind of a thing called shot welding. And Budd, as a new supplier to the passenger train market, started building these streamlined trains. Here are the Twin Zephyrs at the Great Northern Depot in Minneapolis. Now, the great advantage of stainless steel was that it needed no painting. It's stainless steel. And it was beautiful. So whereas even the other people who were manufacturing lighter weight steel cars, they still had to paint them. That stuff still rusted. And there was a design element to this. If you look at the side of it, you'll notice it's what they call fluted. It's like that all down the side. Well, that was done to add structural strength to the walls of the car. But it became an Art Deco design icon to the point where Pullman and the others started taking fluted stainless steel panels and attaching it to the side of the cars to look like that. Greyhound buses started having fluting on the side. Do you remember, and they're actually still there, if you went into Dayton's on the escalators, the sides of the escalators had fluting on them. It was simply designed, and it was all based on these trains. Because for some reason, it's like, well, this is fast and this is modern. And so here's the Twin Zephyrs. They started out as, this was the other thing. These were diesel powered. There had been a few diesel rail cars in the 1920s, but before that it was steam. And steam had all kinds of problems in the sense that, first, steam was incredibly labor intensive to maintain and operate. It polluted. The coaches were not air conditioned before, and so the soot and everything would get into the cars. Now they had air conditioning to keep the soot out, but not only that, these things also didn't take as much time to be maintained along the line. One of the things that you could run this thing nonstop from Minneapolis to Chicago and not have to refuel it. You had to refuel the steam locomotives to do it. So anyway, they started with these two small trains in 1935, and it didn't take very long before there was so much demand. And by the way, all these new trains, the ridership just went like that. There was so much demand that it exceeded the capacity of the train. Okay, so the next year, along comes Milwaukee Road, and they built all their own passenger cars in Milwaukee. And they came up with the Hiawatha, and they built these locomotives. And once again, these are 100-mile-an-hour locomotives. Here's what the first generation of that train looked like. And here's inside the coaches. Now, this is a coach. Look how luxurious this is compared to the coaches we saw before. The seats are high-backed, they're reclining, they swivel, they're nicely decorated. Here's the tail car. Very art deco. They called it a beaver tail car for the obvious sign. It looks like the tail of a beaver. Okay, so now they've got the 400, the Hiawatha, and by the way, the Minneapolis and St. Louis's train had quit in 1918, so that was the first one to drop out. And then in the late 30s, the Rock Island dropped out, and in the 40s, the Chicago Great Western stopped going from Chicago to the Twin Cities and concentrated on going from Chicago to Rochester, Minnesota, to feed the Mayo Clinic. So now you're down to the Burlington, the Milwaukee Road, and the Northwestern. The Sioux line is still running, but they just run a slow train. They weren't trying to compete. So comes 1936. 2 years after the Burlington Zephyr, and they came out with brand new Burlington Zephyrs that were much longer and had a whole lot more passenger capacity, just to meet the market. Here's that later one running along the Mississippi River. Here it is pulling into, this happens to be East Dubuque, Iowa. Now, Northwest Airlines replaced their Ford Trimotors with Lockheed Electras, which were a much fancier plane, and because they knew who the competition were, they dubbed them the Sky Zephyrs. Okay, 1938, the Milwaukee Road completely re-equips their Hiawatha's, and with brand new Hiawatha's. As a matter of fact, what they did then is they took the morning train. They only had one Hiawatha going back and forth. They created a second Hiawatha. And here is that Hiawatha being demonstrated to the public at Minnehaha Park, at the Little Princess Depot at Minnehaha Park. And once again, Art Deco. Here's the tail car. They took the beaver car design and they kind of put it on steroids. And, I mean, doesn't that look like Buck Rogers? Ought to get out of that thing. Okay, so this is 1938. Okay, now the Chicago Northwestern all this time has been running the very fast but very old 400. In 1939, they went and finally streamlined it. And here you see the old one versus the new one, and you see the people. This is at Chicago, at their station in Chicago to demonstrate. They're showing it off to the public. But you can see the contrast between these. And here she is. And the Northwestern was the one that ran through Eau Claire and Milwaukee. And here it is coming out of the St. Paul Union Depot. Up the valley of Trout Brook. And this is an internal shot. They equipped it with stewardesses. There was a thing here, stewardess nurses. They would have registered nurses who would come on and would work with the passengers and help take care of kids and all that. And this was a thing. And here's the dining car for the 400. Okay, now not to be forgotten, while all these fast day trains were getting really faster, the overnighters were still in business. There were three basic overnighters. There was the Milwaukee Road's Pioneer Limited, the Burlington's Black Hawk, and the Chicago Northwestern's Northwestern Limited. They all left Chicago, or they all left either end of the line on like almost the same minute and got in on almost the same minute and competed for the overnight. These now moved to about, a 9-hour schedule. You needed 8 hours just so people could get a night's sleep. So they were on a more relaxed schedule, but they were much faster than they were, and they were straight overnighters. So here's the Pioneer Limited. It's just come into the Milwaukee Road Depot, and it's a sleeping car in the back. And so I was telling you about they had moved away from sections from the old open berths. This is what you had. And they had all kinds of configurations for these. But these are the two most common. The roomette on the right, which was really designed for a one person, and then a double bedroom on the left, which was designed, you had two bunks, an upper and a lower, and they were in different configurations. The number of sleeping car configurations would amaze you. And there were a lot of other variations on these, but these were kind of the two basic ones. And so now you had your own room. Here you are in a double bedroom. Or this might be a double roomette. There was a toilet in there. You didn't have to walk down the hall to use it. There were a few places where they had super deluxe ones that actually had a shower in the room. And so the Pullman porter would go, and during the daytime, these folded up into seats, and at nighttime the Pullman porter would come and make down your bed. And you would also, there was a little hatch at the bottom, and you could leave your shoes there to be shined by the Pullman porter and picked up in the morning along with a newspaper, which would be brought in. I mean, it was a pretty good way to travel. Here's a couple. You see the toilet to the left. There's a fold-down sink, and the sink, by the way, had a slot in the back. So when you wanted to sit in the toilet, you just fold the sink up into the wall. The water would drain out of it, and now these things were kind of a marvel of miniaturization, and so this was the way to travel. All right, so World War II comes and goes, and after World War II, the railroads said, hey, we're going to really take another run at dramatically improving our passenger trains. And so they went, with the exception of the 400, the Burlington and the Milwaukee Road went and replaced their trains. And so this is the 1948 Twin Zephyrs. Here you see them along the river, also along the river. And now here, notice these bubbles on the top? Those are Vistadomes. The greatest passenger rail cars ever made in North America, or anywhere for that matter. The Budd passenger, short dome passenger cars. And the amazing thing about that was that all those seats up in there were not sold. That was simply an amenity for the passengers who were sitting down below. They could go up. And there were more of these dome cars running from the Twin Cities to Chicago than anywhere else in the United States. There were like 7 dome liners every day going between the Twin Cities and Chicago. So we had the best passenger trains in North America. Here's one crossing the Stone. Here's the Zephyr crossing the Stone Arch Bridge. And this thing, by the way, had more dome seats per passenger than any other train in the country, period. And here you can see the cutaway. And so there would be restrooms and lounges and stuff under the dome, coach seats. But they also made some of these into dining cars where you could dine, not on our railroad, but on other railroads where you could dine up in the top. Here you go, 5 Vistadomes on each Twin Zephyr. And here's what it looked like in the Vistadome. You could see all around you. You could see where the train was going. God, I loved riding in Vistadomes. And I actually got to ride in like 3 or 4 of them this last year on tourist railroads. They're still around. And here's a dining car. Here's seats. Okay, well, the Milwaukee Road, not to be outdone, they came up with something called the Superdome. Full-length dome. Now, it didn't have as much forward visibility, but nonetheless, a pretty impressive piece of equipment. By the way, this poster shows them at the Wisconsin Dells, which was a big... and they designed a tail car, an observation car like no one else. This is called and this is what it looked like inside of it. This is called a Skytop car. And here's one of them coming into the St. Paul Union depots. So these things ran on the Hiawathas, and they also ran, the Milwaukee Road created a train to the West Coast called the Olympian Hiawatha, and they had these things here on too. Now just a note, the Sioux line was still running 14 hours between Chicago and the Twin Cities with a World War I vintage passenger cars. And what they were mostly interested in doing was carrying the mail and baggage and stuff. And the train to the Twin Cities was really a branch of their primary train, which was Chicago to Duluth. And so when they got to Owen, Wisconsin, which is up by Chippewa Falls, they would go and spin off a subsidiary train to Minneapolis. But this is the Sioux line. Here it is in Waukesha, Wisconsin. And once again, those cars were built about 1915. And so the Sioux line wasn't trying to compete. But they had their own little passenger business. And the Northwestern ran the 400 until 1963. Their overnight to the Twin Cities quit in about 1960, and they're still running with the same 1939 consist. But it was still fast. This is it crossing the Chippewa River to go into Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Okay, now there's another whole group of trains. Before, we've just been talking about Chicago to Twin Cities, the day trains and the overnighters. But remember, all the Northern Pacific, the Great Northern, and the Milwaukee Road all ran trains from the Twin Cities to the West Coast, to Seattle and Portland. And those trains were forwarded to Chicago by the Burlington or the Milwaukee Road. And those trains had not really participated in the speed up from the Twin Cities to Chicago. In 1945, you can see the Empire Builder was taking the Empire Builder, the North Coast Limited, and the Olympian Hiawatha were all taking 9 hours to get from Twin Cities to Chicago, from St. Paul to Chicago, 3 hours slower than the day trains were. And so starting in the late 40s and into the early 50s, they speeded them up. And so you can see they speeded them up from 9 hours to 6 6.25 hours. The other thing is they speeded them up to the West Coast. They went from 58 hours to about 45, 46 hours to the West Coast. Previous to the speed up, all these big West Coast trains ran as overnighters between Twin Cities and Chicago. And they were really just duplicating the overnight trains that were already running. You know, they had all these passengers coming from Seattle, well, we'll take them to Chicago overnight. Once they speeded them up, they all flipped to day trains and wound up becoming useful in the corridor. And so you went from having 5 day trains a day and 8 overnighters to having 8 day trains and 5 overnighters, which increased the frequency of the day trains, and now these things were running on the same speed. And because they were incredibly luxurious, they really added another level of luxury to the Minneapolis-St. Paul corridor, Chicago corridor. So you had the Empire Builder, and by the way, at the same time they did this, they also had their secondary trains that went to the West Coast through routed to Chicago. Now, they were through routed to Chicago as overnights, but now, before you had to transfer in St. Paul, if you were taking the Western Star or the Main Streeter from Seattle to get to Chicago. Now, once again, you had 3 cars. So here's the Empire Builder. And this is the 1947 Empire Builder, before domes. And in 1953, they went and replaced the Empire Builder with a whole new train and took the 47 Builder and made it into the Western Star, which was their secondary train. So here's the Builder being carried to Chicago by the Burlington. It's got a Burlington engine on the front. And then the Milwaukee Road went and completely re-equipped their train to Seattle and called it the Olympian Hiawatha. Here's in the Olympian Hiawatha. And I have 2 slides out of order. Here's the Empire Builder out there in the Rockies. And the Empire Builder went and got great domes and short domes. So the Empire Builder went in the 1950s and added a great dome and 3 short domes to their train. Here you are in the dome. The North Coast Limited, not to be outdone, put in 4 domes on their train. And here's the North Coast Limited coming through Westminster Junction into St. Paul and coming into Chicago. And I think I got the last slide coming up here. One of the things I always loved, the trains were famous for their dining cars. I remember having trout on the Milwaukee Road. It was very good. In the case of the Northern Pacific, it was the Great Big Baked Potato. Anybody remember the Great Big Baked Potato on the Northern Pacific? There you see them, up there in the black and white photo. Big Idaho. They went through Idaho, so they got spuds from Idaho, and that was a marketing deal. So anyway, all of this has gone away. Now all we have are the Empire Builder, seen here at Wisconsin Dells, and the new Borealis, which has turned out to be a great success. And it would be even a bigger success if Amtrak actually had some more passenger cars. Amtrak doesn't have enough passenger cars to meet the demand. And so the consist is restricted, and but anyway, I just wanted to see what had been. There we go, folks, that's it. Oh, one other thing, the book, I don't have these to sell because they're not mine to sell, but I did this for an organization. This is the book that this program is about. And I did this there's a little outfit out of Chicago, a railfan group called the Shoreline Interurban Historical Society. And their website is, if you want this book, you can order it through them, because there's a lot more stuff in here than I was able to show you. But anyway, Shoreline Interurban Historical Society. And somewhere or another I had oh yeah, here we go. Shoreline.org, but it's shore-line.org, if anybody wants that. So, questions, comments? Yes, sir?
I rode on a train my mom called the Milk Run. Do you know anything about milk runs?
Well, the milk run is just another, that was not the formal name of the train. The milk run was just another term for a local. And by a local, I mean one that made all the stops, and it had a tendency, and one of the things that they did in certain places was they carried milk to cities.
Right.
And
You could see them when it would just stop for 2 minutes and there was a
there'd be a milk can on the.
Yeah, that's right.
Where was this?
This was between, the Twin Cities and Dubuque, Davenport.
Okay, I'm a little surprised there was milk on that. There was big organized milk trains that went into Boston, went into New York, went into Chicago. But there was milk carried on the trains. Okay, yes, sir.
Just a comment. When I was about 25, we took our daughter to the West Coast on the train. And we were parked, the train was parked in Bismarck in the middle of the day, and it was rush hour. And there were cars right up to the train, and they're all sitting there looking at us. Like, would you please move the train? And I'll never forget the look of this driver, and we were in the dining car at the time, and we're looking out the window, and this guy's growling at us.
Well, one of the sublime pleasures of railroading and being on a passenger train is you can pull in, and if the train is long enough that in the station its tail end is blocking an intersection, those people can't go anywhere, and you can just sit there and watch them steam. And
luxurious meal at
exactly that. I'm pleased you had that experience. Okay, who's next? Well, right in the front here, Joe Allen.
You mentioned the gas lights in the Pullman. Were those like kerosene or?
I believe they probably were. The brand name was Pinch, the Pinch lights, but I'm not entirely sure what they were burning. It was some kind of oil or gas or something. Oh, wait a minute. No, I take that back. I think this was actually gas. It was the same technology as in homes before electricity, where they would have a reservoir in the train and it was piped to these. So no, I'm sorry, it was gas.
In a slide you showed that it looked like about late 30s or 40s. It showed a waiter and also looked like a conductor, and they were both white. And I'm wondering, a lot of us know the history that the porters were African American, all of the Pullman porters. When did that end? When were there start to be white waiters and conductors?
Well, there was always a white steward in the dining car. The waiters could be white or could be black, but were often black. The cooks could be white or could be black. African Americans, though, were never conductors, were never brakemen, were always either porters or red caps in the station, or dining car waiters, or sometimes like baggage handlers or something. I mean, so there was definite segregation, no question about it. I think starting probably in about the 60s or so was when, the 50s and the 60s, when you started to see that break down.
There were other iconic train systems and trains going on at the same time in Europe and in Canada. And I'm wondering about the relationship, the Orient Express and the transcontinental Canadian trains. What was the relationship of those to the American trains?
Well, the Canadian trains, you had the Canadian National Railroad and the Canadian Pacific, and they ran trains all the way across. But there were some cross-border trains. The Soo Line, which is always headquartered here locally, has for many years been a subsidiary of the Canadian Pacific. And going all the way back to the 1910s and such, they ran trains from Chicago through the Twin Cities up into North Dakota, through Minot, up to a little town called Portal, where the border crossing was, and then all the way out to Vancouver. There were also from the Twin Cities, the Soo Line, the Northern Pacific, and the Great Northern all ran trains to Winnipeg. There were cross-border trains certainly from Vancouver down to Seattle, from Montreal down to New York and Boston, from Toronto to Chicago and Toronto into New York. So, you know, there was always a certain amount of cross-border stuff. And usually what happened then was that the American Railroad would hand the train off to the Canadian Railroad. But they cooperated.
Was there any influence on the change of styles and everything with like the great European trains and stuff?
No, the European trains did not influence the American trains really at all. They were completely separate. In terms of the Canadian trains, yes, the Canadian trains, the manufacturers were either, the Canadian manufacturers were often either owned or licensed to use American designs. And as a matter of fact, the last of the great 50 streamliners, which is running its final years, is the Canadian. And if the Canadian was built by Budd and has exactly the same kind of cars as the Twin Cities Zephyr had. Those cars are now 70 years old. They've been rebuilt multiple times, but they're still running. I rode them this last summer.
So you showed a great number of images, and I'm just interested in the research process you went through.
Well, it's mostly stuff I've been accumulating for many, many years. I mean, I've been a train fan my whole life, and for the book, I got a great deal of assistance from several archives, railroad archives. There's one in Baraboo, Wisconsin called Lake States Archive. There are railroad-specific historical societies on the Burlington, the Northern Pacific, the Great Northern. I got stuff from them. The folks at Shoreline, who were the sponsors for the book, had a lot of contacts at some of these places where there is a tremendous archive called what's the name of that? Railway, oh man, I'm blocking on the name. They're down in Madison, Wisconsin. The Center for Railway Photography and Art. And they have a huge archive of the best photography. There's a whole subculture of railroad fans and railroad photographs, and they've got the best stuff. So I got a lot of stuff from them, too.
Aaron, your photos of the dome cars brought back memories of after dark canoodling with a woman who's been my wife for 50 years on our way to Prairie du Chien, where my parents lived. However, I had a question that's actually not about one of the stations or trains you showed, but the most modern photo you showed of the Milwaukee Road Depot has a distinctive building in the background, and I wondered if that is the Metropolitan Building.
No, it would not have been visible from that angle.
You showed the Metropolitan Building in one photo behind something. I can't remember which photo it was.
It was the color photo of the
Was that the old postcard view? Yeah. I'm trying to think, because the Metropolitan Building, you'd have to get the right angle to pick it up.
With all these passenger lines vying for speed, how did they handle the logistics of freight trains, passenger lines, different speeds, getting into terminals?
The passenger trains had priority. As a matter of fact, there was a rule, and it's in the book here. On the 400, nothing was allowed to be on the line. Everything had to be off on side tracks within 15 minutes of when the 400 is supposed to show up. They cleared the railroad for it. And by the way, the ethic back then, these were 90-mile-an-hour railroads. That was the track speed. But being on time and making the schedule was the culture, and so they'd go over 100 if they needed to. And I've got in the book here, somebody did an oral history for one of the engineers, and he said they kind of shake when you get up about 110.
I think it was the 400, but I've taken that, and there were two stations in La Crosse. Why was that?
No, that would be either the Milwaukee Road or the Burlington, and their lines crossed in La Crosse, but they had separate stations.
But we stopped twice in La Crosse.
Well, all I could think of in La Crosse is that you might have stopped on the Burlington at the yard to make some kind of a crew change or something. which was not at the station. That's the only reason I could think of why you would want to stop twice. Or you stopped because you were crossing the Milwaukee Road and there was a conflict. There's a place.
They took on passengers and dropped off.
I'm sorry, it doesn't sound right to me, but I can't explain it. I don't know. Uh-huh.
You mentioned how important it was to them to get the train in on time and clearing the track and prep. I'm just sort of wondering, since we just had a big snowstorm, how often did they miss it because of some of the weather that we endure up here?
Well, yeah, I mean, the weather would get in the way, and the weather would definitely slow you down. But they kind of prided themselves on getting through no matter what, even if they were late.
Aaron, if I could just ask something that occurred to me. As the speeds for the passenger trains improved because of better track and other equipment changes, did that have any effect on the speed of freight traffic, or was that more, were there stops more frequently for that prevented them from getting up to those speeds?
It probably didn't really change because there was kind of an upper limit to how fast you could run a freight train. It takes a whole lot more horsepower to get from 50 miles an hour to 70 miles per hour with a freight train. And, there's a lot of railroads that, will say, hey, we're happy with 40 miles an hour. We want to get there reliably, but the cost in terms of fuel and all that and the locomotives is, when you really start running fast, is sometimes prohibitive.
I was a paper boy with the Minneapolis Tribune back in the early 1960s, and they offered a train trip to and from Chicago if you got a certain number of new orders for the paper subscriptions. And it was a great trip. I mean, we took the rain. I don't remember which line it was, but it was one of the probably three that were existing then. And went down to Chicago, stayed in a beautiful hotel down there, and they took us on tours to the Museum of Science and Industry and lots of other interesting places in Chicago.
All right. Okay, that do it? Very good. Hey, thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Yeah.